love Liz. Welcome back to True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. Although I look a bit different, as you know. Nose surgery a few weeks ago, face is massively swollen. Not gonna lie, don't look my best right now. Bit on the distorted side. It will reduce in time. So if you're offended by my face, hopefully in 3 weeks I'll look kind of average, if nothing else. Having said that, let's get back to what this channel is about, in case you have stumbled across it for no other reason than having a very big interest in true crime. I release my content on a Wednesday and Sunday religiously. Crime and consistency is my motto, hence why I'm doing this in spite of still looking a state. I wanted to bring a case to you today that genuinely sparked my interest when I initially read about it, and I wanted to dig deeper. It's a personal desire of mine to find out how this case played out, and also I needed to wait until the courts had dealt with it before I brought it to you. Also note that I'm wearing some new merch. Links below, I've got some really nice new designs. My eldest son is really artistic, and so he's started doing some, shall we say, more bespoke designs. Have a look if you fancy it. Let's get on with today's case. So, it begins on the 11th of May, 2021. Police in Athens, Greece receive a call, and that call comes from 32-year-old Babis Anagnostopoulos. He's known as Babis, thank God, because I am not excellent at pronouncing Greek names at all. So police accept the fact that I will be referring to him as Babis throughout this, just so I don't get stuck on that name constantly, provoking an anxiety that means inevitably I pronounce it incorrectly all the way through, because genuinely, that would definitely happen. So he calls emergency services, and apparently the way that he says he had to call emergency services was with his nose. He needed to dial emergency services with the tip of his nose because he didn't have the use of his hands at the time. And he tells the police that a gang of foreign thieves have broken into his home. They've tied him up. And basically he's been rendered useless at this situation because he can't move, he can't do anything, and devastatingly his family has been put at risk. So Babis and 20-year-old Caroline Crouch, that was his wife, they lived together, and they lived together in a suburban Athens maisonette. They had a beautiful 11-month-old daughter, Lydia. And Caroline had recently also adopted a puppy, Roxy. And Roxy was absolutely adored by her. She'd only adopted that gorgeous dog a few months earlier. It'd been a stray. She'd seen it on the streets. She had made efforts to domesticate the dog, invite that dog into her home, and she was devoted to the dog. I'm saying that because I think that when we look at characters, the way that somebody is around vulnerability demonstrates a great deal of their level of empathy and compassion. For her to just notice a stray and to take responsibility for that stray and to love it and to give it a home, it says something to me about her personality. She's clearly a very, very loving human being. And I think that one of the things when you read paper reports and you kind of see things on the news, you only ever get this kind of really momentary look at the individual who has lost their life. And it's really important, therefore, to take these breadcrumb trails and bring them to you so that you understand what kind of a person she was. Now, Babis was actually a UK-trained aviator. He was a helicopter pilot. He was the son of a civil engineer and a school teacher, so had had a relatively nice childhood, obviously had thrived because he'd managed to achieve those particular goals. Now, Caroline was a student when she met Babis, but she had initially been born in the UK, but her family moved to Greece when she was still an infant, so clearly that was the place that she was completely familiar with. Her father, David, he was a retired oil executive, and her mother, Susan, was from the Philippines, and her mother worked in tourism on the island. They ran a hospitality business. So clearly, as a child, Caroline would have been brought up with lots of opportunities. Her parents were successful. And you can imagine, can't you, growing up in a beautiful place that she clearly did. I mean, it's a gorgeous area that I'm talking to you about. Babis meets Caroline on the island of Alonissos. That's where she'd been raised. And I will tell you now, she had had a blissful childhood. Blissful. Both because she was absolutely adored by her parents and her family, but also just because of her lived experience, the environment that she was brought up in. She lived in a villa, she had views of the azure Aegean Sea, and she was very bright. She excelled academically, she excelled in sport, she was a really great student. Everything that every single parent would want in a child. And that's before saying, you know, she was also genetically blessed. She was absolutely stunning. And she wasn't somebody who just took sports lightly. She was hardcore invested in what she did. She became a black belt kickboxer in the end. She learned to swim age 3. She qualified as a scuba diver. She was also an excellent kayaker. I mean, at this point, most of us parents are sitting there thinking, why don't my kids not do all these things? I don't know whether it's just me, but I think that's pretty darned impressive that we're talking about a young woman here, and she clearly is committed to things that she loves. She's got a vitality for living and for life in general. She's out there doing things and living a dream. But if that's not enough to describe what an awesome addition to our world Caroline was, it's that she was fluent in English, Greek, French, and Tagalog. So Tagalog is her mum's Filipino language. So massively capable when it came down to languages. Very, very bright girl. She was also known to be a keen scout, and she would also take parts in displays of traditional Greek dancing, and she would enjoy performing in theatre productions. She was one of those people that as a child, you can tell she was growing into a young person that would be considered, I suppose we would use the term, an all-rounder. She was just great at everything that she did. She could turn her hand to anything and she could excel in it. She met Babis when she was 15. Just remember that for a minute. And she met him when she was taking part in this candlelight parade. It was to mark Good Friday at the time. He was actually 13 years older than her, so he was almost twice her age. I know, guys, that horses for courses, people meet people, fall in love. Sometimes you can't help who you fall in love with, but for me, if you're 13 years older than a 16-year-old, you should not be looking at that person in that way. That's my personal belief. I think it's really strange. I don't think that you can look at a 16 or 15-year-old and imagine that they have the world views, perspectives, conscious understanding of what it's like to be a human being of 20 odd when they're 16. You have totally different viewpoints about where you are in life, what life is meant to be. And also at 16 and 15, those kind of age frames, really, you should be looking forward to lots of fun with your mates. But they obviously connect in spite of this, and they start a sexual relationship with one another when she was 16. He was 29. Honestly, I find it really strange. I do. I can completely appreciate why a 16-year-old might find a 29-year-old alluring and interesting. I can imagine that at the end of the day, she would have been blindsided by this incredible pilot that walked into her life and just showed her that kind of interest. You know, those kind of things stand out when you're 16. But for a 29-year-old man, there is just a vast difference, isn't there? And it automatically makes me ask that question. What could he possibly have found in common with her? And if he didn't have a great deal in common with her, what was it that stood out about her? Personally, I think her looks and the fact that she came from a great family, and on top of that, probably the fact that she was quite exotic, all those languages that she could speak. But above everything else, I would imagine that what really stood out for him was the interest that she would have shown in him, because at 16, when you're falling for somebody who's considerably older than you, you have a lot of time to invest in your devotion towards them. You hero worship them. Personally, I think he would have found it intoxicating that this young girl would have found him so interesting, intriguing, mysterious, and all the things that she would afford him, because she's a kid. And one of the things that he would actually do, which again draws me into this idea that he wanted people to imagine that he was this great man, that he was really interesting and clever and better than all the other boys that she could have met. And you're like, yeah, because you're a man, so clearly other 16-year-olds ain't going to be flying over her school in a helicopter to impress her. I mean, he doesn't even need to do that, does he? Because she's going to be going to school with kids her own age. Like, it's pretty insane if somebody picks you up in a car at that age. You're like, hey, somebody's picking me up in a car that isn't my dad or my mum. At the end of the day, again, it says something about his ego. He wants to impress her. He wants to let the world know that they're together. But also, he likes the hero worship that they're all going to feel towards this man who is just significantly older and should potentially be noted as a bit of a creep, in my opinion. But no, that's not how he's thinking about this. He just imagines that they are all going to be swooning at the fact that he can ride a helicopter. I said ride. I know I did. I meant fly. You totally know where I was going with that. This is what he said about Caroline. She's the rarest person I have ever met in my life. A brilliant woman. At 16, you could speak with her about anything. Her personality was lovely. She filled anyone with love. Now, I do not doubt whatsoever that that quote is true about Caroline. I believe that she was a brilliant woman. I believe that her personality was lovely and that she filled everybody that she met with love. But the bit about you could speak to her about anything, no, you couldn't. You couldn't. There's no way you could speak to her about anything because she was 16. She didn't have the experience of the world. She hadn't had a long-term job. She'd not owned a home. There are all these things that means that she wouldn't relate to many things. So again, he's making you feel that even though she was just 16 when they met, somehow she was above and beyond other 16-year-olds and had a maturity that was reasonable as to why they had connected. I think he knew when he started talking to the press about these things that a lot of people would be quite judgmental about their relationship and arguably in that judgment think that he was a little bit on the odd side for dating a girl that was so much younger. Everyone would understand why she had dated him, but not vice versa. Now by 2021, they've been together for 4 years. They get married during this period of time, and it isn't a very well planned wedding. In fact, it's a spur of the moment fairy tale wedding in Portugal. That's on the Algarve. It's a lovely area. Apparently, it was described as the kind of wedding that you only see in films. Now, Caroline's only 18 at this point, so they've only been together a couple of years. Also worth noting, hadn't told her parents. She just told them that she was going on holiday. Personally, if my own children did that, I would make them annul the wedding just so I could get involved in planning the wedding. That may sound controlling. I'm just saying, my kids better invite me to the wedding. I've invested a lot in them emotionally, psychologically, physically, and financially over the years. I want some payback, such as wearing a big hat at the wedding. That's what you do as a mother and mother-in-law, isn't it? But they don't do that. So David and Susan, Caroline's parents, obviously have her return from this holiday and realise that she's now actually a wife. I will note that David and Susan, Caroline's parents, were actually very impressed by Babis when they met him. He seemed to make their daughter happy, I appreciate that most of us have a bias, that even when something is a bit dodgy on paper, if we meet the person and we like the person, it can alter the shade that we have of them. And I think in this case, that's what David and Susan do. I think they are incredibly kind, that they don't at that point feel unbelievably angry that they've been denied being part of that decision process, but also being present at that wedding. Again, when you think about Babis, he's a grown-up. He will have had situations where he's been hurt, you would imagine. Life will have gone wrong at times for him. So he'll know about potential impact on other people's feelings. Making sure that her parents weren't involved in the process, he must have known would have been something challenging for them. But he goes ahead and convinces her to do that anyway. And I would imagine that Caroline was swept up in the moment, thinks that she's met the man of her dreams. It's 2 years into the relationship. Believe me, that is still the honeymoon period. I talk about that a great deal on this channel. Most people can behave very, very well for a few years. So getting married and believing that you've met the man of your dreams, she's living a rom-com. She really is. And she hasn't got the distance traveled to understand how challenging life can be, how challenging marriage can be, how challenging relationships can be. She's got evidence that she has parents who are very happy, who are loving and loved. So her role models are primary carers she looks at, and she sees marriage as a brilliant institution. So again, there is a reasoning potentially behind a desire to get married. So going back to that phone call, when the police actually arrive at Babis's, they get to the home on the 11th of May 2021, they are utterly stunned by what they see. They are met with such a horrific, shocking sight. First of all, when they enter the property, what they notice is Caroline's puppy. And Caroline's puppy is hanging from the banister. That puppy had been choked to death, and it wouldn't have been fast. It would have taken time for that darling little puppy to have died. Then upstairs, they go to look at what's occurred, to see whether there's anybody still in the property, and also to find victims, essentially. It's at that point they discover Caroline's dead body. Her dead body is on the bed, and her baby, her beautiful little baby, is just crying alongside her. It's a horrific image, isn't it? To imagine that all that what baby wants is their mother's arms around them, and instead their mother is lying, slowly going cold because she's been murdered. They find Babis then, and when they find him, he's got his hands and his feet. They are still bound with duct tape. He's handcuffed to the floor, and he's handcuffed to the floor near his dead wife's body. He's got duct tape on his eyes, he's got duct tape on his mouth. And when the police actually free him, he touches Caroline and he says to her, "Honey, are you okay?" He just seems, as far as the first responders are concerned, to be in absolute shock. And when they inform him, look, Caroline's dead, he just sat on the bed, totally numb. He asks the officers to hand him his child so that he can hug his child. One of the things that was also noted is that when he sees the dog that's hanging there, he just shows absolutely no emotion. I mean, their pet dog is hanging from the banister, her beloved puppy, and he just doesn't seem to react. But again, we all know, don't we, that when people are in terrible shock, they're not processing the world in the way that they would do in other circumstances. So some people do just become fully overwhelmed in that moment, become silent, despondent, disassociate at times, and not in any way represent how they would be in ordinary circumstances. But it kind of alerts the police a little bit because it's such a shocking sight. They've struggled with it. They're in a situation where walking in and finding that puppy hanging has really traumatized them. Babis then tells the police what played out. And he says that 3 masked armed men, he didn't know whether they were Albanian or Georgian criminals, but he kind of indicates that they were foreign. He says that they burst into the home. It's about 4:30 a.m. when this assault began. He said another one of them remained outside, and that person, he believed, was outside guarding the building, making sure that those inside were not disturbed. At this point, they tie him up, they blindfold him, which would be absolutely terrifying, particularly when you have your wife and your baby present. You can't imagine for 1 minute having the opportunity to retaliate and to resist taken away from you by being placed in a situation where you can't move. He says that once they've managed to do that, that's when they turn their attention to his wife. And he said that even though he was in a scenario where he was helpless, what he couldn't escape were the noises that he heard. He said they tortured her for hours. And all the while that they're torturing her, they're trying to get her to reveal whereabouts there is cash and where the jewelry is in the home. And she's not trying to resist that, clearly, but she's not giving them what they want and what they need, and they're continuing to assault her and abuse her and harm her. And then finally, hours after this torture begins, they strangle her. They strangle her to death in front of her 11-month-old baby daughter. Her daughter is present when she is murdered. And then he says they also clearly killed the family dog, and they hanged its body from the first floor stair banister. Now, Babis also said that they did get away with certain stuff. They took 15,000 euros. Ultimately, these 15,000 euros had apparently been hidden in a board game, so they'd managed to get that. He also explained to the police that during this violent assault and his wife being tortured, he was constantly drifting in and out of consciousness. They were being held captive, but he wasn't present in mind all the time. But he would come round and then he would just hear these horrible cries. His wife would be crying for help. He also said that at points they actually threatened his baby. They got a pistol and they held that pistol to the child's temple. Both he and Caroline were begging for their lives. He actually said, I saw them suddenly in front of me. Sometimes they pointed the guns in their hands at me, and other times at my baby. They kept saying, where's the money? Immediately I told them where I'd hidden it. We bought a plot of land and he had money in the house for initial works. I heard my wife, who was tied up in the bed, constantly shouting for help. We begged them not to do us any harm. So after Babis has described this scene of horror to the police, then they take Caroline's body from the house. And this is when they begin looking for the perpetrators, this hunt that is activated, because Greece is absolutely shocked and saddened and actually really stunned by the events, because believe me, statistically, this kind of a brutal crime is very rare in Greek society. So it was something that shocked the entire country because it is not what they are used to. Simple as that. These kind of really high violent levels of crime don't play out, particularly towards a mother, a young woman. That's not the kind of victim you would imagine to be murdered in these circumstances. I mean, when you think about the fact there is a man there and a woman there, whilst I'm not saying for 1 minute it would be acceptable to kill either of them, to some degree, my mind instantly imagines the male being the person who would get the brunt of the aggression. Because, like it or otherwise, whilst criminals are criminals and people do horrible things to one another, often they will themselves have some boundaries, and women won't necessarily be people that are as comfortable beating, harming and killing than the male involved in the situation. Particularly a male who's been willing to give out information about where money is and so on and so forth. So this is really shocking for the whole of Greece. And because of that, literally within hours of the murder, the authorities decide to announce a €300,000 reward because they want information. They want to know who this criminal gang is. They want to apprehend them because this looks like a crime that might play out again and again and again. They were organised, they knew what they wanted, they knew how to achieve it, and they aren't afraid to kill. So clearly that is posing a great threat to people who are residents in Greece. So they're asking now for information that can lead to the apprehension and arrest of this criminal gang. This is so rare to offer this kind of reward in Greece. Genuinely, it's happened 4 times previously. So the authorities were absolutely 100% behind bringing these individuals to justice ASAP. Officers then start doing the investigation that you would imagine. So part of that is trawling just through hundreds and hundreds of hours of CCTV footage. The thinking behind doing this is because they feel that the people who are responsible for this crime were likely individuals who would have been following the couple for several days, figuring out where their movements, seeing where they lived, scoping out how they were going to carry it out, and they imagine, therefore, that there will be evidence on camera somewhere of potential suspects that have been caught on CCTV, but they're not able to identify literally any potential suspects. They don't even manage to identify a getaway vehicle. So that's pretty strange, because it's not even as if there are potential suspects coming up. Nothing is seeming to fit the MO of this crime right now. Then they get the autopsy results on Caroline back. Bear in mind what I've told you about this woman. She is a black belt kickboxer. You know, I would not want to get into a fight with Caroline because she is able to defend herself, right? So even though these people have broken in and obviously done these heinous things, you're going to imagine that Caroline is going to have fought to some degree. And yet when the autopsy results come back, they can't find any foreign DNA under her fingernails. That's a major blow to the investigation. Because the fact that Caroline is a black belt kickboxer, therefore you would imagine that she would at least put up a struggle to some degree before she was killed. They'd hope to find DNA evidence. So it now stands to reason when they're looking at that she didn't struggle. Basically, it suggests that she put up no resistance when she was choked to death. It doesn't make sense. Even if you've been terrified for your life, even if you've been tortured, even if you've been put in a position where obviously you are facing your mortality, you in those final throes, those final moments are gonna fight, scratch, bite, do whatever you can because it's a natural survival mechanism. So you're gonna think there is gonna be foreign material belonging to the perpetrators down her nails, or at least on her body. And the coroner actually believes, after the autopsy has been done, that the way that she was murdered was probably strangled with her own t-shirt. So the officers look at this and what they think is, okay, so this criminal gang, they weren't there to just steal. They actually were here to kill. It's as if, whilst it was meant to look like a robbery, that wasn't their intention. Their intention was to murder, because they had every single opportunity to walk away from the scene of the crime. They got the money. There was literally no need to kill her. They left Babis alive. They left the baby alive. So essentially there were witnesses who were left. Why had they decided to kill her? So their understanding at this point is, well, because they genuinely were going in there to specifically wish to kill. So this poor, innocent young mother has now been murdered, and the police are believing that she was the target of that crime. Doesn't add up, does it? I mean, we've heard of lots of horrific killings. We know lots of cases where people are murdered because they're witnesses. It's very unusual for a woman to be murdered in this circumstance where her husband has been left alive, and now we have a major issue because there is literally no forensic evidence indicating that other people have been involved in that crime, or that can, most importantly, connect that DNA evidence that she would have gathered under her nails with the perpetrators. It means that the forensics are drawing a blank at this moment in time. For 37 days after Caroline's death, Babis sticks to this version of events. So he stays absolutely on point. He covers these events constantly, consistently, and does not move from that story. By this point, we have a whole nation, an absolute entire nation, and they are expressing their support. They are expressing their sympathy, understandably, for this grieving husband, this widower, who now, of course, is in a scenario where he's got a little baby to bring up by himself. His beautiful wife heinously murdered. The whole country just wants to reach out, extend their condolences, their sympathy, extend their care, to let him know that even though he feels so alone at this moment in time, that even though he has had the most tragic circumstance happen to his family, that he's not alone, that they're there for him, that they'll be there for he and his child, the whole country.
Έχει όσα περισσότερα μπορούσαμε να μαζέψουμε και κάθε μέρα αυτή τη στιγμή είναι 10, 15, 20 άνθρωποι στο δρόμο και ψάχνουν. Αυτό ξέρω, είναι με συνέχεια σε επικοινωνία μαζί μου όσο έχω μπορέσει να τους βοηθήσω. Αν υπάρχει κάποιος που μπορεί να τους βρει, θα τους βρουν τα παιδιά αυτά.
Ήταν τόσο σκληροί, δηλαδή δεν καταλάβαιναν από τα παρακάλια σας, από αυτά που τους λέγατε.
Τις οικεσίες σας όλα αυτά τα πράγματα. Μας έδεσαν και από εκείνο το σημείο και μετά δεν τους είχαμε πει ήδη που είναι τα χρήματα. Δεν ξέρω.
Εσύ κατάφερες και πήρες τηλέφωνο.
Όταν συνειδητοποιήσεις ότι η γυναίκα σου δεν βρίσκεται σε ζωή.
Όταν μέλησαν η αστυνομία. Όταν ήρθαν οι αστυνόμοι μέσα και μέλησαν και έβγαλαν από το κεφάλι μου τα δεσμά.
Και η κορούλα?
Η κορούλα μου ευτυχώς δεν έχει χτυπήσει, πήγε στο νοσοκομείο προληπτικά και ευτυχώς είναι καλά.
But the investigators are not quite as convinced by the actions of this grieving widow, because they want to bring the right people to justice for this murder. They are absolutely committed. And they start noticing that there are holes that are appearing in his story. Now, it turns out that the picture he's presenting, of course, is that he's lost the love of his life. That he and Caroline have got this perfect world together, that he's utterly grief-stricken. He's broken. But as the police start asking questions, and they do, they start asking questions of their nearest and dearest, of their friendship groups. They ask people who knew the couple and their relationship. And pretty soon there's a different picture being brought out. There's a different picture being painted. Because it turns out Babis and Caroline were not actually this really happy couple that he's presenting them to be. In fact, their relationship was struggling, and it was struggling to a degree that they had actually been attending therapy sessions. And they were seeing the same psychologist for individual counselling. So this psychologist was seeing Babis and Caroline separately, but around the marital issues. Now, on one level, we can also say, well, that's a very mature thing to do. Look, if you're struggling in your relationship and you have the funds where you can go and talk to an independent party who can help you to resolve those issues and also point out some of the ways of coping better in conflict, that's incredible. And they were doing that. So again, that is testament to them trying to work at the relationship. But it also shows that there are some real problems within it. It's got to that point. When couples go for counselling, it's usually because they feel that they're coming to the end of their relationship, and if there is not an intervention that is effective, or there isn't behaviours that shift and change appropriately, that relationship will come to an end. They've got a child, so clearly at this point they had wanted to try to repair it. But I think we can all agree that this relationship is probably coming to its conclusion unless some kind of real intervention makes a difference to the situation. Then when investigators talk to her friends, this same story is being painted, that at the end of the day, she wanted to spend time with her mates. She wanted to go out and have fun. He was not okay with that. Remember, she's a really young woman. Yes, she's got a baby, but she's very, very young. Of course she wants to go and hang out with her mates, and that's really important for her mental health anyway, and he doesn't like it. Also, she's complained about his behaviour. she's noted that he's becoming more and more controlling. We often see this in scenarios where a relationship starts to break down. The person who is already causing problems in the relationship, let's say they are a little bit jealous or controlling, as opposed to that giving them a wake-up call where they think to themselves, maybe I need to back off, relax a little bit, acknowledge their needs. Instead, it works in the opposite direction and it makes them more controlling, more jealous. So the more that she pulls towards her friends, the more that he's pulling her back towards him. Also, if that isn't enough to start making investigators think closely about Babis's story, investigators actually believe that on the night that Caroline was killed, the couple had been arguing. So there were text messages between the two of them that essentially suggested that all was not well within the relationship. In one message, one had referred to the other as stupid. And according to the data on her phone, what Caroline had done that evening was she tried to book a hotel and she tried to leave the family home that night. In fact, she even messaged a friend that very same night saying that she was leaving Babis. So now we've gone from this loving family who are really connected, where everything's hunky-dory, until these violent criminals break in and murder a member of that said family, to their relationship was falling apart. She was wanting to leave Babis and she was even making plans that very night to get away. Then they start looking at Babis's smart devices, because that's what they do. It always kind of surprises me that in every single case, these kind of technological flaws in the way that people carry out crimes just speak volumes. It's as if when criminals plan, they don't really understand just how sophisticated investigators are these days. Forensic analysts, when it comes down to data on phones and movements and search history, they're all over it. If they are given a device, they can literally track everything. I mean, it's shocking the amount of data they can get. It worries me sometimes. Sometimes I search for things and think, I wonder how this would go if they were kind of putting me in court and reading it out. Or the other one, you know, I text things to people and I have a really macabre sense of humour and really dark sense of humour. And then I think if they read that out in court and actually did it in a really serious way, and I was trying to defend myself, going, no, I didn't really mean it like that. Seriously, I think they would just like throw the book at me and I'd be completely innocent. It's just my sense of humour. But again, it just demonstrates that when you are put in the light as being a potential suspect and they get your smart devices, you better hope that you haven't been doing anything wrong, because they are gonna know. And there are so many crimes that I've covered where these kind of things have brought them down, such like Joanna Dennehy, the serial killer in the UK. If you've not seen that video, I've done a video on her, but again, she killed 3 men, tried to kill another 2. One of the things that really got her banged to rights was that her mobile phone connected with the mast where the bodies were found. These kind of digital footprints make such a difference to cases these days. So they look at these smart devices, and Babis's basically indicates that during this time, that, remember, he's tied up, he can't move, he's handcuffed, he's got duct tape all over him, but apparently in spite of this, he's been active. He's been moving around the house, which, unless he's really great at some kind of Houdini act and hopping, because his legs were duct tied together, it's not going to have happened unless he was genuinely just moving around the house. And it's not just because of the fact that they've got technology such as his mobile phone, it's because he had a step counter app on his mobile itself. So not only can they tell that he's moving, they can tell physically he's moving because his steps are going up. And they can even tell that he's moving between the attic and the basement. So he's going up and down. It's impossible. How on earth could he be moving when apparently he's the victim of this sadistic crime? But Remember, he had told the investigators that not only had he been restrained, he'd also kept losing consciousness for around half an hour, he said this. And he said that was due to the tape being wrapped around his neck so tightly. Now, again, this is ridiculous, isn't it? They can tell that that makes no sense based on the fact that he has a step monitor on his phone and it's recorded activity, along with being able to trace where the phone has been in the house. Also, and this again is absolutely devastating for him as far as his story goes, because when they look at Caroline's smart devices, they're actually able to find out that her heart had actually stopped beating several hours before the alleged robbery. And the reason that they were able to find that out was because Caroline was wearing a biometric watch. And they measure a lot of things, but the key thing that it measured here is her pulse. And the fact that her pulse had stopped hours before Babis suggested that she had even been murdered. So now they can see that Babis's story just is not holding up. They know that her time of death was incorrect to what he's reported. They know that he's apparently tied up, duct taped, completely unable to move, in and out of consciousness, I don't know, whilst climbing up to the attic and going down to the basement. I mean, unless the perpetrators took him to the attic and then rolled him down the stairs all the way down to the basement and then returned him up again and so on and so forth. But one would imagine at that point he would have been battered and bruised to a degree that they would have been able to evidence. But I'm being sarcastic. It's clear, isn't it? He has been going up and down those stairs. Detectives are also able to establish there are issues with Babis's story regarding the security camera. So they know that the security camera has indeed been tampered with. There's no doubt about that. But it's been tampered with way earlier than Babis had claimed to police. So the memory card had actually been removed around 1:20 a.m. But Babis had stated to the investigators that the robbers had removed it several hours later as they entered the house. So again, I mean, I don't want to go too far with this right now, guys, but I think bang to rights is certainly coming into my mindset, isn't it? He's definitely on the route to being caught to some degree red-handed. Personally, at this point, if I was an investigator, I would only have one suspect. Now, whilst this investigation is continuing, what happens is Caroline is buried on the island of Olonissos. This is where she was raised. And of course, we have Babis playing the grieving husband. And so he gives this incredibly moving eulogy at the funeral, and he says this: "I am lucky that I met you, very lucky that you loved me, and even more lucky that you are the mother of my child. Lydia will grow up not remembering her wonderful mother, but Caroline, who was the joy of life, will always be near me through Lydia." Oh, it gets stuck in my throat, that, because I know exactly how this is going to play out. But again, he's happy to place himself in the centre of attention. He's happy to get all the condolences. He's very happy to be centre stage in the grief process. Bear in mind, Caroline had loving parents. They have lost their daughter in the most heinous of ways. The fact also that when he talks about her in that eulogy, that Lydia is not going to grow up remembering her, that really smarts with me. It really does. That shouldn't be in a eulogy. Yes, we know that Lydia is going to be denied the opportunity to know her loving, gorgeous mother, but she has family around her who are going to reinforce and remind that baby every single day of her life what an incredible human being her mum was. So she may not physically know and remember her in the way that we would wish for her, but she will know and remember her through the memories of others. The fact that he's almost saying in that eulogy, yeah, she's not going to know or remember her. It's like, really? Actually, she will. She'll probably know her intimately all the way through her life because of the stories that others tell her, through the photographs, through the memories, through through the fact that you keep that person alive, albeit when they are not physically present. There's loads of photographs as well where you actually see him comforting Caroline's grieving mother. You would expect to see that, of course. You expect to see the widow of somebody who's also the son-in-law of their parent being kind. But you kind of note he is play acting at this point, guys. He really is. He's play acting. And I genuinely think at this moment in time, all he's concerned about is fitting the stereotypical look of somebody who has lost their wife. Now, of course, whilst this is all going on, the police have been building a case, and at this very point, they genuinely feel that they've got enough evidence to bring Babis in, at least for further questioning, to investigate further. And they go and pick him up after the memorial service for his wife on Alonissos. So it's kind of a statement, isn't it? I feel them choosing to do that after the memorial service, firstly, it's a mark of respect to not disrupt the actual service itself, but it's a statement. Because why would they pick him up just after the memorial service unless they were trying to make it clear to those around him that he's a suspect? The officers also tell him at this point a suspect has been identified. Just think about that. He gets picked up, he's playing the dutiful widow, and suddenly the police are picking him up, but they're saying they have identified a suspect, but they're not telling him, you're the suspect. So he just thinks potentially at this point, right, someone's in the frame for this, I'm getting away with it. And all the while, as they fly him back to Athens, the police know you are our main suspect. They arrest him as soon as he gets off the plane in Athens. They then interrogate him. That interrogation lasts for 8 hours. It's a long time. It's hard going. And at the end of those 8 hours, Babis just breaks down. And it's at this point he confesses what really happened that night. So he admits, he and Caroline had been arguing. They'd been arguing for hours on the day that she died, and that they'd got angry and it had been exhausting, and then things culminated. Caroline apparently pushes her child off the bed and also throws her into the cot. So now he's making out that this loving mother, who's devoted, by the way, to her baby, devoted to her baby, devoted to vulnerable animals, hence why the puppy had been brought into their home. Now all of a sudden, she's a violent perpetrator. She's pushing their child off the bed. She's throwing her into a cot, doing these incredibly dangerous things. Also, he then accuses her of all these dangerous outbursts that he'd had to witness her have in their relationship. He said that he had been the victim of abuse at her hands. He said that when she got angry, she would punch him, she would kick him. And this is something that had broken Babis, essentially. He then also claimed that her behaviour had initially changed when she'd had a miscarriage. She'd miscarried before she'd managed to successfully get pregnant and give birth to Lydia. He said that when that happened, she had just this mental health decline, and he noticed that she became much more angry, far more argumentative. He said that one of the things that he believed was that she took her grief out on him. By the way, worth noting, all the people who knew the couple said that was absolute BS. There was no change towards him after the miscarriage, but she did feel incredibly trapped in an unhappy marriage. And again, guys, let's be honest, I'm sure that pretty much every single one of you will not have acted brilliantly when a relationship's coming to an end. You know, the whole premise when something's coming to an end is you're kind of like, I need you to realise I don't want to be in this relationship anymore, but I'm finding it really difficult to tell you. So people often get into conflict and get to situations of crisis. So in the end, they can ultimately be like, I don't want this anymore. You know, it's difficult. And sometimes people say the worst things ever. They text, they shout, they scream horrible things at one another. But that does not lead to people getting murdered. In fact, the vast majority of people can recall moments in their lives where things have been said and done and it's led to nothing but the end of a relationship. Sometimes it's been something that has led to the healing of a relationship in the long term because they've realised they're in crisis and they need to work through it. What I'm saying is, it is not unusual for couples to go through very difficult situations and not be very nice to each other. But it's no reasoning behind going ahead and harming somebody. And particularly for this young woman, she's clearly very unhappy in that marriage. She's told a lot of people. And what's hugely frustrating when I'm telling you this story is, of course, we've only got one side. We only have Babis's account because Caroline is dead. She's dead in a murder that was staged to look like somebody else had done it. Now, I am all for believing that crimes of passion occur. We see it. It's terrible. It's tragic. It shouldn't happen. But some people in moments snap. And it doesn't mean they're not guilty of murder. But you can kind of see it was in that moment, and then they ring emergency services. They admit what they've done straight away. They are horrified by their actions. They recoil from what they have done. They don't sit there and are like, oh, I've just murdered my missus or murdered my husband. What I'll do now is, I don't know, stage a scene, make up perpetrators and hang my dog. That says a whole other level of premeditation in my mind. And the fact that she isn't here at this moment to even defend what he's saying to investigators about her behaviour, the fact that he's ripping her apart on a reputation level, saying that she's an abuser of her child, let alone of him. And then he goes on to say that on the night that the murder occurred, she apparently pushed and punched him. And later on, he had just eventually, finally, of course, you know, he's the one that's just been quiet and just got on with this horrible abuse. But then there's this moment and he becomes enraged because she refuses to apologise for her part in the row, and she refuses to apologise for pushing their child off the bed. Note how he brings in the idea that he's obviously apologised for his part, but she won't. And that's the moment that he snaps. Because not only are they in a situation where apparently there's been this physical abuse, now she's even threatening to hit her child again, whilst at the same time threatening to leave him and to take the baby. This is genuinely his story. At that point, he says that his judgment became really blurred and he just loses control. He smothers her with a pillow in a fit of anger. Bear in mind, this is whilst their baby daughter was sleeping alongside her. Now, at first, it basically says, I didn't think I'd killed her, I just thought she'd fainted. Well, not being weird, but somebody faints when they're just walking along and they black out. They don't faint because somebody is smothering them with a pillow. If he means at first, I thought I'd smothered her to a point where she was unconscious, we'll give him that. But no, he said he thought she'd just fainted. Again, minimising, isn't he? He's minimising. But then he says he realises that she was dead because her eyes were open. Come on, guys. Just think about this for a second. If somebody is knowingly being smothered, they will kick and fight like hell. If they are prepared for this kind of attack in those moments, honestly, it's incredible the amount of fighting that you will do to survive. But he's just painting this picture of being able to just smother her with a pillow and not even believe that it killed her. And essentially, remember, there's no forensic evidence down her nails that suggests that there's no big struggle. What did she just do? Lie there and allow him to do it? That doesn't make any sense. So he then panics, apparently, realising that he's killed his wife. At this point, we'd say, okay, you've made the most critical of errors and you've got to pay the consequences. Call emergency services or try resuscitation. Do anything in this moment in time where potentially you can help her. So, as opposed to doing that, he says that all he could think about was that he wasn't going to be able to hide the body. So, why would your mind go to that? I've just killed my wife, the mother of my child. What's my next thought? Oh, I'm going to struggle to know where to hide the body. Said no crime of passion, snapping situation ever. He's not concerned about what he's just done to his wife. He's instantly concerned about him. He's instantly concerned about facing consequences. So when he realizes that he can't just hide her body, instead he thinks, I know, I'll stage a robbery. But he wants to make it really, really credible. And he thinks, well, if I'm going to get a group of sadistic killers coming and taking my wife's life, I need to think about just how sadistic they would be. So I'm going to take my wife's absolutely adored 7-month-old puppy, Roxy, and I'm going to hang it from the banister using its leash. And that's what he does. And if that's not bad enough, after he has murdered his wife and dog, he then places their 11-month-old daughter next to her dead mother's body on the bed. Can you believe the sadistic nature of this human being? Who thinks like that after they have carried this kind of crime out? Look, no one should ever end up getting murdered. But after you have just carried out this kind of killing, apparently in a moment of madness, your next thought isn't, oh, how do I cover my tracks? Because that makes you somebody who has great potential to do harm to other people. You don't think you deserve consequences. You've got no responsibility, no accountability. As far as you're concerned, they deserve it. You need to move on with your life, right? That's what I get from that crime that I've just described. He then admits that he actually ties his own hands. He ties those of his dead wife's hands. Also, he'd hidden his wife's wedding rings and jewellery in the fuel tank of his motorcycle because he wanted to support this idea of the botched robbery. So he didn't think that they would ever find them there. And he's able to tell the police that the main motivation behind this ludicrous cover-up is because he said he was scared of going to prison and that he wouldn't be able to raise his daughter if he was in prison. Really? That's your reasoning? You're okay with murdering her mother, taking the most important relationship away from that child because she's annoyed you for wanting to leave you, but you think that it's better that you stay out of prison even though you were a murderer to bring up that child you have denied having a mother. I'm not sure your daughter will see it that way. And when she grows up and hears of her grandparents, the kind of human being that you are, I doubt there will ever be any relationship between either of you. You stole her mother. So one of the things that Babis has done when he's talked to the investigators that I've just explained is he's blamed his wife for him having to kill her. That's what he's done. And he claims that it was her narcissistic and aggressive behaviour that were to blame for his fit of rage that led to these actions. This is a grown-ass adult man with a really young wife. And he apparently can't control himself around her. He's this victim of domestic abuse. There is nothing evident in that relationship that suggests that she was in any way abusive towards Babis at all. But there is a lot of evidence that he was incredibly jealous, he was controlling, and he did not want her to leave him, particularly with his daughter. I will note that investigators actually said that there was an amazing capacity as far as Babis was concerned to act. He was a top-class actor. That's what they noted about him. Not only had he staged this very detailed crime scene, he had managed to keep up that facade without breaking character for over a month. He'd done it really effectively. Another thing that happened in this case, which was just a bit mind-blowing when I read it, was that During the investigation, obviously they're out there looking. Remember what's been said by Babis. They've given a description out about the perpetrators, and 3 senior Greek detectives actually got demoted because they got a completely innocent man, a Georgia man, who they brought in. He was 36 years of age. Apparently, they tied him to a chair for 4 days and they tortured him for a confession. Apparently, they were beating this poor innocent man up for days and he knew nothing about the crime. They just wanted to get somebody charged. So these 3 police officers basically get demoted, and I'm like, I'm not sure demoting them is acceptable. I kind of think violently torturing somebody and tying them to a chair for 4 days before making them confess to a crime they knew nothing about, it's probably, time to sack them. It worries me that they are still in the force. It's like, are you the police officers who tied an innocent man to a chair, beat him repeatedly, made him confess to a crime he had never committed? We are. I'm just going to throw it out that I would rather have somebody else interview me about my shoplifting potential offence. Anyway, they kept the jobs. Who knew? At least in the UK and the States and most other countries in the Western world, we wouldn't expect that to happen. But nonetheless, maybe they were great officers and maybe the person they brought in, they genuinely believed had committed the crime. I don't know. I know Greece is very, very lovely. I will admit, I'm never going to get arrested there just because I know that that might happen. Again, please accept the fact I know I have views from Greece, and I appreciate that most police officers will be great and would be horrified at these actions. Also, like I noted, you cannot hold the police fully responsible for the actions of a few, but it's really not okay, is it? And the police investigation also got really heavily criticised because there was so much crucial evidence that had been missed. It's almost like Babis was so convincing initially that they weren't looking at the crime scene in the way they should have in forensic detail, and particularly in detail to Babis. And it meant that lots of evidence had been missed. So they didn't take Babis's mobile phone. He had that for a whole week after the killing. Also, one of the things that they failed to notice was that the windows had been tampered with from the inside. From the inside. I mean, why? The people are coming from the outside. Why would they be tampering with the windows on the inside? I don't think these violent perpetrators that apparently had murdered his wife would be just, going around trying to create some extra damage, like twiddling with things just to annoy Babis. So that stands out, the fact that they haven't investigated correctly. Also, they failed to notice that the memory cards have been removed from the CCTV system, which is bizarre. I mean, they're out grabbing an innocent guy and torturing him for days. You'll do. You look like the kind of person who'd murder a woman. But they don't actually forensically look at the detail in the way that they should have. Also, one of the things that should have struck them, I don't know, within 1 second of arriving at the scene is that whilst Babis was tied up, he was completely uninjured. I mean, are you kidding me? I haven't needed any forensic training, crime scene investigation training to know that I'm going to look at the disparity within the crime. I'm going to be like, why is this beautiful woman dead? Why has she not got loads of bruises as well? And that doesn't make sense. These are like the cleanest criminals in the world, that the scene itself doesn't seem to be one where there's been a violent struggle. And this guy, what, did they just lightly tie him up, making sure not to abrade the skin or cause any injury? Like, that isn't right. That's not what you'd expect. If Babis had these people come into his home, there would be some form of struggle, even if it was him struggling when he was being tied up because he's terrified that his wife and his baby are going to be harmed. But there's nothing. Now, please say that they had always suspected Babis. Like, could you maybe have told Those officers who you demoted because they basically beat up an innocent guy and tortured him trying to get a confession, was that just like a ruse? Oh, we really know who we're really looking at. We're looking at Babis. We think he's probably the main suspect. It looks like he's the perpetrator, but you know what we're gonna do? We're just gonna, I don't know, grab a random off the street, interrogate them, beat them, tie them to a chair, and then be like, it's a bit of a hijinks. We knew we had this guy, really. Genuinely, you can't write this, can you? Anyway, because they say they initially suspected him, they also add to that. The reason that they hadn't then immediately arrested him was because they couldn't actually find DNA or any other evidence at that moment in time to corroborate their suspicions. So they didn't, for example, find his DNA down her nails because there had been some kind of fight, and therefore it was difficult to make the connection, albeit that they apparently knew it was him. Like I said, I just can't get past the innocent guy that got beaten up for no reason if they genuinely thought it was Babis. But I digress. I digress a little bit there. When Caroline's mum was told by the police that Babis had confessed, she was absolutely stunned. She was blindsided beyond belief. And all she could think about was the fact that that man who hugged and comforted her at Caroline's memorial, that man who wrapped his arms around her, used his hands to comfort her, acting as the grieving widow, was the same man who had used those same hands to snuff the life from her daughter. To add insult to injury, and if there is any way of making this man seem even more inhuman than I have already done in this case, he'd even asked her parents to pay the £3,500 for Caroline's coffin, and he asked them to fly her body from Athens. By the way, they had previously given Caroline and Babis €60,000 to buy a plot of land. They were so generous. And this is because they wanted to help contribute. They wanted to help their daughter and her husband build a house on it. When they found out that Babis had only registered the name in his own name, so that land was only in his name, that meant that there was no legal standing as far as Caroline was concerned. It was his. He basically took that money from her parents to benefit himself. And again, what does that tell you about him? And what does that tell you about his intentions? He's married to this woman. Apparently he loves this woman. Apparently it's a crime of passion. Okay, well, why are you planning and plotting things where it only benefits you? I can completely empathise with Susan. The idea that the last time she had seen that man she did not know, he was her daughter's murderer. And she was comforting him too. How dare he take that from her? When they charged Babis, and I think it's really powerful that they did this, they actually charged him with premeditated murder. And also, something that warms my heart, they also charged him with an unprovoked killing of an animal. Now that was a new offence. It had literally only come into force the previous year. He was also charged with perverting the course of justice because, of course, he told all those lies to the police. They had tortured an innocent guy, but also the cost of doing all of the things around that was something that didn't need to play out. So he gets charged with that. And if he was found guilty of all of those charges, well, potentially he faced life in prison. During this process, we have to remember there's a little girl, isn't there? An innocent little baby girl whose mother has been ripped from her. A child who, unbeknownst in this moment to her, has had her life changed forever because of the evil actions of her parent, her father, the man who, above any other man, was meant to protect her. So this child now becomes an issue of custody. Who will take her? So the Athens court makes a decision. the right decision, the only decision as far as I'm concerned. And they award custody of the couple's child to Caroline's parents. They also revoke entirely Babis's parental rights. Damn straight they do. So he's no longer the legal father. And Caroline's parents now can love and cherish this extension of the daughter they've been denied. He spends his time during waiting for the trial doing what lots of narcissists do. He read law books, of course he did. Because you know what he wants to do? He wants to think about all the defences that he can come up with. He is schooling himself how best he can play this case to try to get the lowest sentence possible. Can you believe that? Again, where is the moral compass? Oh, I tell you what, doesn't have one, doesn't have a moral compass, was born without said moral compass. Because again, it shows that he has such low accountability and responsibility, all he wants to do is to get out. The trial began in April 2022 this year. It began in Athens. And as this is such a recent crime, it's also worth remembering that we're still talking about a little baby girl who's lost her mum. This is the child who is now growing up without the arms of that parent that she deserved. And it's heinous, isn't it? To imagine the fact that this man was willing to essentially corrupt the system in the way that he did to ensure that he got away and had the freedom that he didn't deserve, but also hoping that he'd be able to bring up the child whose mother had stolen. This was a very evocative case in Greece. And clearly they're taking it as seriously as possible because of the fact that they even bring in this charge about Roxy the puppy. So as well as the public prosecutor, which is the lawyer that was hired by Caroline's parents, they also had a separate legal representation for Roxy, for the dog. An animal welfare group had covered the cost, and I love it. I absolutely have such respect for the prosecutor making the decision to do that, but also for that animal welfare group who wanted to take a stand. They wanted to represent Roxy. How dare he have done that to that innocent animal? So he has these forms of prosecution that are being created because it has created such an evocative response in the nation. And one of the things that was noted outside the court was there were animal welfare activists who were protesting, there were women's organisations who were protesting, they were all outside court. This had sparked so many feelings in those who felt affected by this. When it came to giving evidence, Babis did that a year to the day that he took his wife's life. Of course, he just claims that the whole experience of killing her was just a massive mistake. It was a crime of passion. It wasn't premeditated. He said that he'd been provoked. He just lost control. And the truth is, if he had managed to plead that case successfully, he would have got a reduced sentence, because if it's not premeditated, it does reduce the amount of years that you would serve. Instantly, we were all thinking, mate, if it wasn't premeditated, why are you putting land in your own name? If it wasn't premeditated, why were you so good at trying to cover your tracks? If it wasn't premeditated, why weren't you in a massive panic and out of control and losing your shit to the point where you couldn't do anything because you were so terrified by what you had carried out? He was calm, he was cool, he was calculated, wasn't he? We can see that in the aftermath. But this is his defense, and it's because he wants to get out earlier. He even says this to the court: there is no excuse for my actions. What has been lost is irreplaceable. Neither Caroline nor our dog deserved it. I tell you what, Babis, no one needs to hear you say that. No one's out there thinking, God, you know what? That puppy deserved it. Literally no one. No one's sitting there going, the way he treated Caroline, totally measured response. It's just word bubbles, isn't it? It's just saying stuff that you don't mean because you think it will make sense, but really it's so shallow, it kind of makes you even more guilty. He claims during his defence that they had an argument in bed. We've all had arguments at different times, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the afternoon, sometimes early evening, sometimes after a few drinks, sometimes in bed. It happens. I can go with him on that one. You're having a bit of a spat in bed. But at this point, he decides that the way that he's going to manage that is to climb on top of Caroline so that she can't hit him as easily. So they're having an argument in bed. She's a black belt. I wouldn't want to have a fight with her. Bear in mind, when they found him, he didn't have any marks on him, so she clearly hadn't made any contact with his body. But does he decide that potentially she may? So he climbs on top of her just in case. Makes no sense whatsoever, and actually would automatically place him in the domestic abuser category because she hasn't actually thrown any punches, because we know this, there were no injuries. Therefore, what he is doing is restraining her unnecessarily. That's at best. Forget what we're actually talking about now, which is the fact that he murders her. Apparently he says that he's telling her to calm down when he's doing this. I mean, I don't know about you guys. I think that it seems totally rational that if somebody literally straddles me and restrains me and then tells me to calm down, it may have the opposite effect. Who thinks that straddling somebody and getting on top of them is going to be a calming effect? It's not. I mean, this isn't what happened anyway, but even using his own argument, it doesn't make any sense. And he says that in spite of the fact that she's apparently being calmed down by him straddling her and preventing her moving, apparently she's still verbally abusive. And at that point, he places one pillow over her head. The judge rightly so says, how could you have done that to someone that you loved? And Babis replied this: I had no purpose, there was no logic in my blurred mind at that moment. And when I saw her in profile and understood that she was dead from her eyes, which were open, and her pulse, I lost it. I began to weep and pull my hair and go back and forth across the room. From the day I lost Caroline, I lost everything. I lost my life. Sorry, how are we grading that? Oh, is it a U? It's a U. Literally. How dare he say, from the day I lost Caroline, I lost everything, I lost my life, in the context he's trying to say it, which is that her loss is his greatest punishment. No. You did lose your life when you killed Caroline. You lost your life and your freedom. And that's what you're bothered about in this situation. You don't care about her. Then he said that after apparently panicking, moving from room to room, rocking back and forth, pulling his hair, he suddenly decides that he's going to hang her puppy from the banister to make the fake robbery look more credible. Which it didn't, by the way. It's just not genuinely what happens. I mean, he's not in the mafia. He's not going to wake up with a horse head next to him, is he? It's just not what we expect to see in home invasions. So he tells the court this: it was impossible to look. I left and went into the kitchen so that I didn't see or hear it die. Number one, it's not an it. It had a name. It was called Roxy. Number two, you didn't care. The fact that you're saying you found it difficult, you couldn't confront it, you didn't want to watch it die, as you put it, the disassociation between what you actually did and the pain that animal would have endured. But on top of that, the fact that you feel it was bad for you, you had to look after your own feelings when you were murdering a defenseless animal. I really don't like this guy. I find this kind of human being who is so full of excuses, so unable to take responsibility, so willing to punish innocent people and animals. These really are the most dangerous predators in our societies. When it comes down to the prosecution, they massively disagree with Babis and what he's saying. They say there is absolutely no way that he was out of control. In fact, they believe it was cold-blooded murder, pure and simple. It was premeditated, he had planned it, he had taken an opportunity to carry that out, simple as. They say he was in a calm state of mind. I think we can all agree with that. It's pretty easy to assert there was a calmness with the way that he constructed the crime scene and killed his dog. Also, the prosecution contended the couple had had a heated argument earlier that evening, Caroline threatening to divorce him and take the baby, because the evidence seemed to suggest that Caroline was actually asleep when her husband attacked her. In fact, the prosecution brought out, after they'd done a detailed forensic analysis on her device data, that she had literally been asleep for 2 hours at least before she was killed. She was completely unsuspecting, she was completely helpless, completely defenseless. She never stood a chance. The coroner was able, during the case, to confirm that she had been asphyxiated, and it's heartbreaking to tell you what that coroner said, because after they examined her body, they said that her death would have been agonising. It would have taken 5 to 6 minutes to die. And you can just imagine, when we've been in pain for 5 seconds, it can feel like a year. Pain is just something that seems to stop time. Imagine it taking 5 to 6 minutes for you to suffocate. The coroner said it would have induced a state of physical and psychic stress in her during those last moments. They also looked at Caroline's diaries, and they were able to read out in court some of the inserts, and they just told of her unhappiness. She was so unhappy in that marriage. She described her feelings of being powerless. She felt trapped. She felt suffocated, ironically. Isn't it interesting that she said she felt trapped, she felt powerless, and she felt suffocated? If ever that was a description of those last moments of her life too. She stated that she wanted to leave Babis in July 2020. This is when their little girl was literally 1 month of age. She also said that she wanted to leave him before she fell pregnant. So this was constantly on her mind. So this is, early on to some degree, after those first couple of years, it feels like things shifted potentially when they got married, because we know that controllers, manipulators, coercive controllers, domestic abusers, a lot of times they like to know that there is a connection legally so that they feel even more in dominion over them. And that's when we see the behaviour shift sometimes, that they know that you are now their wife or their husband, and they feel a level of ownership, and it incites more of that negative behaviour. So I wonder whether after those initial few years of them being happy, the moment they get married, that's when he believes that she belongs to him and he can treat her however he wishes to treat her. When she has the baby, even though she's expressing a month after that she wants to leave him, she changes her mind to some degree, because she feels like she wants to give her daughter the best opportunity of a family growing up. Remember, she's had an amazing family. She's so loved. She's had a gorgeous life with her parents. She wants that for her child. So she feels that she needs to try at least to give her little girl a mother and a father. And then there is another entry in that diary where they do describe a fight. She says that she'd hit him and he had broken down a door. So you can see there is a level of toxicity here. But for him to break down a door, I mean, that's terrifying, isn't it? When these extracts were read out, Babis apparently broke down in tears. But what they noted about him during the court case that was really interesting and stood out was, even though he cried, particularly when it was mentioned that he had been hit during arguments, he didn't actually cry once during the horrific details of the autopsy and the description of Caroline's death. Oh yeah, so moved by the mention of him being in a scenario where he got hit. But a violent murder of his wife, carried out in a protracted and torturous manner to some degree, that really didn't bother him. You know what I mean? On a scale of 1 to 10, I'm not registering. But if it's about me, then I'm going to cry. Honestly, people like this boil my blood. They had a court-appointed psychiatrist because they wanted to assess Babis to see what his mindset was like. And they came out with, well, he's a narcissist. Yeah, they said that he was narcissistic, he was a controlling individual, and he exhibited signs of antisocial personality disorder. Also, apparently he had a psychopathic personality, a lack of empathy for both his wife and his daughter. He was unable to deal with rejection, and he had wanted to be admired for his relationship with a much younger, stroke better, stroke kinder, stroke all-round greater human than he would ever be. I've added those last bits, but that's one of the things they came out with, that he liked the idea of having this beautiful young wife, and the idea of losing that because she was just a possession to him incensed him. Simple as that. And what I've just talked about with the antisocial personality disorder, the psychopathic issues, the obvious narcissism that's been described throughout what we've seen in his behaviour, that is a whole heap of horrible. If you've got a partner who is displaying those kind of traits or is classified that way, run for the hills. Genuinely, irredeemable. You're not going to be able to help them. They're not going to be able to change. It's just who they are. Go and pack your running shoes and get yourself out. Simple as that. Also, as I said earlier on, it's worth reminding ourselves that they actually had a couples therapist, and this couples therapist had extensive notes and had worked with Babis and Caroline. And that therapist had worked with them for several months, and they described Babis as extremely manipulative. They stated Caroline was absolutely in love with the idea of Babis on paper, you know, this pilot, this guy who looked good, these big dreams of a life together. It all sounded fabulous, but in reality, she really struggled with the person he really was. In fact, the therapist said that she hated the person that he really was. Said that Babis was very aware of his extreme control, and that he knew he was an individual who was controlling his wife and exerting that control over her. So he acknowledged that in therapy. He knew he was a controller. And she actually stated in court, when a person is manipulative, like the accused, he wants at any moment to know where the other is. So basically, that therapist is saying this individual cannot allow his wife any freedom whatsoever. She must be at his beck and call. The marriage was also noted to have become increasingly abusive, and Caroline told the therapist that she genuinely at times was left without any means to even shop. She had no money. He would just leave her without any access to finances. So we're seeing, aren't we, that coercive control playing out there. Financial manipulation and control is a part of it. And whenever her mum sent money, and clearly they've been very generous with the couple prior to this, the reality is that he would just take it from her. And one of the things that she'd wanted to do was she'd wanted to go to pastry school. He wouldn't let her because he would take all the money that arrived and he would control it. Even down to the transport that she took. Yeah, Caroline was literally only allowed to travel in a taxi who was a friend of her husband's. Simple as that. So that was the only transport she was allowed. It was a friend of her husband's who had a taxi themselves, and he was seen as the only appropriate person to allow Caroline to go places. How controlling is that? I mean, it was clear, wasn't it? Throughout what she's expressed to her friends, throughout what she's written in her diary, that she was desperate to leave him. And she was desperate to just take her child and to go somewhere happy and safe. And the therapist that they actually saw also said this: the behaviour of the accused towards Caroline was extremely manipulative, extremely controlling. Very often, Caroline didn't understand it herself. She'd be closed in the house for days alone. So she's essentially being kept a prisoner, essentially being made to accept this hostile treatment of the man who's meant to care and protect her. Even down to the point where she's left with little money or no money, to the point where she can't actually eat. Now, this therapist had actually seen the couple around a dozen times, and then suddenly out of the blue, Babis writes to her cancelling the sessions. But then she hears on the news that Caroline has been murdered. And this particular therapist is great, because in that moment, she knew. She was absolutely, immediately, without question, convinced that Babis had murdered Caroline. So much so that she actually went ahead and she contacted her lawyer to express her concerns. The therapist actually expressed her opinion that even the killing of the puppy was actually symbolic. She felt that by killing the puppy first, because they believed the puppy was actually killed first, it was symbolic of punishing Caroline further, because she had adored that dog. Also, the therapist believed that the way that he murdered Caroline was also symbolic. She died in his hands. He'd even controlled her demise. He'd played God. He was the all-powerful, the all-dominant, the all-deciding. She stated this: he could feel her dying, and he murdered her. He also exhibited abusive behaviour towards the child, which he placed next to her mother's dead body. A baby has a special relationship with the mother, which he abused, putting her next to the lifeless body of her mother. We all need a therapist like this, genuinely. I don't know this person, I'll never meet this person, but I instantly connect with the empathy, compassion, and the righteous justice that she believes deserves to play out in this case for Caroline. Babis told the court, of course, because he's a massive liar, that, I shouted that, didn't I? Shouted that, but he did, and he is. He tells the court that basically this is just not true. My priority had always been my wife's happiness. Really? It's always been your wife's happiness? Yes, it's always been my wife's happiness. Has it really been your wife's happiness that you're mostly concerned with? Absolutely. 100%. If there was 120%, it'd be 120%. You stole the money that her mother sent, preventing her from doing things like, I don't know, eating, going to pastry school, just providing for her daughter. You make a good point, but that's because she was really happy without anything. I imagine that's how he interprets his actions. As I said, narcissistic. So he's crying when he makes the next statement, of course, you know, saying that he's got no words, no excuses for why he killed her, even though I've just listed all the ones that he gave. He said, there are no excuses for what happened a year ago. Not to myself, not to anyone. What was lost a year ago is irreplaceable. She didn't deserve what happened. Our dog didn't deserve it, or anyone else. What? When you mean anyone else, are we talking about the guy who was tortured for 4 days, tied to a chair, interrogated and made to say a false confession, even though he had nothing to do with it? Throwing it out there. I shall continue. He said, the word sorry is not enough. No matter how many times I tell her now that I'm sorry, she won't enjoy her life. Well, you can't tell her sorry because you murdered her, and the communication ain't going to get to any other dimension because you've got a place in hell that's reserved just for you, sweetheart. But That's what he's saying. Basically, feel sorry for me because I've realised the error of my ways and now I have to cope without the love of my life. Blah, blah, blah. Anyway, he says all he can think about is the fact that he'll never see Caroline again. By the way, love the prosecutor in this case, who's like, yeah, you're not going to see her again because you killed her, you murdered her. These are Babis's closing words to court. I hope all those who have been hurt, all those who have lost, will someday forgive me. I hope that God will forgive me. I will never forgive myself. Good. You shouldn't. And also, I'm not sure the great big God will forgive you. Just putting it out there. Personal thoughts. The 7-member mixed tribunal of judges and jurors, by the way, unanimously found Babis guilty of premeditated murder. They also found him guilty of deliberately killing the family's pet dog, and they also found him guilty of perverting the course of justice. When they read out that verdict, Babis remained completely expressionless. Just didn't react. The tribunal also concluded that Babis should receive the toughest penalty possible. So they imposed a life sentence, and that life sentence came with a minimum term of 16 years for Caroline's murder. And he also received 11 years and 6 months for killing the dog and perverting the course of justice. I love the fact that the dog was recognised. Caroline would have wanted that. She would have wanted to know that her much loved puppy that she'd rescued from the streets was given reference here, was noted as a valuable sentient life. It really matters. I have such respect for the fact that they have done that and they have made him pay for that further. He also was given a fine. He was given a fine of €21,000. It works out about £17,800. He will serve at least 18 years. Now, whether he'll get out after that, don't know. But he's definitely going to be inside for 18 years. And let me tell you guys, he's not going to be serving his time somewhere cushy. No, I looked it up and I was like, ooh, people really need to think about whether to commit crime in Greece per se. Because he is going to be serving it in a place called Korydallos. It is the toughest prison in Greece. And when it comes down to Greece, the prison system itself isn't great. It's known to have one of the worst prison systems in Europe. It's known for overcrowding, gang violence, and also housing anarchist terrorists. So, not exactly the kind of mix you'd want round on a Saturday night for a barbecue. Maybe some of you watching would be like, I don't know, it would be quite interesting. As long as there were a lot of armed guards, maybe I'd want to have a conversation with them. I know a lot of us feel that way about our dinner parties. If you threw the perfect dinner party of people from places and positions in time, who would you have? Quite a lot of us would bring back a few serial killers, wouldn't we? Just to ask the questions, but we would want them to probably be in some kind of, I don't know, Hannibal chair cage thing. Throwing it out there, always think about your protection. So after all of this has been heard and the verdict has been announced, and thank God he's given a strong sentence, Caroline's father came and stated this. When he eventually completes his sentence, which many people think he may not survive, he will be a changed man, a broken man, far older than his true age. Now that fate is settled, Susan and I can move on. I intend to change Lydia's name to that of her mother, so that she will never be associated with this odious creature. I will ensure that he never gets to see his daughter or to have any contact with her whatsoever. Amen to that, my love. Amen to that, David. You are absolutely right. And I don't think that any of us could have put those sentiments better. He says that the only thing that has actually kept him going, and I think that we can all agree losing a child is the most painful loss that you can endure, let alone in a traumatic death like murder. I understand that so many people question their own mortality and whether they want to remain a part of this world when they lose a child. But he says it's knowing that he has to keep going for his wife, but also for his granddaughter. And both he and his wife, without her, stated that they would struggle to be here. And David said this about his wife and their granddaughter, although, let's be honest, David and his wife are absolutely now this little beautiful girl's parents, and they will bring her up as mother and father. Caroline can't do that. But nonetheless, it's beautiful what he says about his wife and the way that she treats that little girl. He said she treats her exactly as she treated Caroline when she was a baby. She plays with her continually when she's awake, and she is alert to the slightest sound when she's asleep. The household is centred on Lydia. His wife and Lydia actually sleep together in Caroline's childhood bed, which makes me want to cry, if I'm honest, but also I can see how in being in that bed that Caroline grew up in and having her child with her in that space brings them all very close together. It keeps Caroline as part of that parenting experience, doesn't it? Now, I'll also say that Caroline's parents are amazing because they realise that Babis's parents are not anything other than victims themselves. And because of that, they've said to Babis's parents that they're free to visit Lydia whenever they wish, which I think is amazing. And I agree, of course, Babis's parents are not in any way to blame for this heinous crime, but lots of people would just want to completely disconnect, wouldn't they, to avoid any kind of relationship that reminds them of the monster that stole their daughter's life. But these as a couple are gracious and kind and compassionate. And I draw you back to what I talked about initially when we discussed the fact that Caroline had taken in that puppy. She obviously has the same compassion running through her veins because her parents brought her up with the compassion that ran through theirs. And it's such a shame that she doesn't get to continue the life that she would have flourished in with that little girl if she'd been allowed to just leave that toxic, abusive relationship. People who watched Babis in court said that the only tears that he cried were tears he felt for himself. He's never shown any true remorse at all. In fact, when people who watched that particular case play out, they felt, particularly the press did, in fact, that you could compare the case to that of Oscar Pistorius. Now, Oscar Pistorius is somebody that you've asked me to cover, and I will get round to it, I promise. But for those of you who don't know the case, he was a South African sprinter, and in 2015 he was convicted of fatally shooting his girlfriend Reva Steenkamp. This was in his Pretoria home. Reva had also been in a very controlling, abusive relationship with him. And Pistorius had lied about the way that she died, claimed that he shot her multiple times through the bathroom door, but the reason that he'd done it was that he believed at the time of shooting her that she was actually an intruder. I know, it's unbelievable the depths that these individuals will drop to try to get themselves off these kind of crimes. It's interesting to note that in Greece there has actually been a recent increase in a number of femicides, and these have typically occurred, from what I've gathered, when a woman has decided that she wants to leave the relationship with the abusive partner. When you look at cases in the UK, one thing that's been really prevalent to me is that domestic abuse cases have soared during the pandemic and during, in particular, lockdown restrictions. So we've seen an increase in these kind of horrific situations play out. And it also seems that in Greece, that's reflected. Now, Greece have been so moved by the fact that they are unhappy about these incremental shifts in women being harmed that they launched a public campaign, and that campaign was all about getting victims of domestic violence to speak up. Between January and October 2021, 12 women who were aged between 19 and 75 were allegedly murdered by husbands or partners in Greece. So they're obviously very, very concerned about this and want to change that narrative and that reality playing out. Thank you so much for joining me for this case. It was one I really felt that I needed to cover. The moment I saw her beautiful face in the paper with her little girl and realised immediately, before I discovered that the police had indeed recognised he was the main suspect, I said to my husband, he did it. There is no doubt whatsoever they should look nowhere else. I knew from reading the story, from immediately connecting with the over-concocted scenario, the fact that he wasn't injured, the dog being hung, straight away, I knew it was without doubt a partner crime. Simple as. And it was such a relief when I realised that they were, in fact, shining the spotlight on him, and in the end that they got that confession, because it was just so obvious to me from the get-go that we were dealing with a man who killed his partner, a man who should have been looking after his wife and child, and instead brutally slayed her, thus preventing that gorgeous little girl Lydia from ever growing up knowing the shining star that her mother was. Let me know your thoughts on this. If you've found this an interesting case, give me a like, subscribe, give me a comment, let me know about your thoughts. I imagine a lot of us will be very angry. And also, just a reminder to all of you out there, because the truth is there's been a lot about domestic abuse in the news recently with the Depp Heard case. Everyone has different views on that. But I just want to remind you all, if you're in a situation where somebody is in any way, shape or form abusive, whether they're calling you names, whether they're controlling you financially, whether they're abusing you physically, as in kicking, punching, hitting, spitting, whether they're making you feel less than and going out of their way to affect your self-esteem and sense of self-value, if they humiliate you, if they do all of those things, if they deny you access to the things that you enjoy and the friends that support you, get out. It's hard, guys. I appreciate it. It's tough. But I promise you, there is a better world outside of those relationships. No matter what they tell you, no matter how they belittle you, no matter how many times they say you'll never cope without them. That's how they keep you trapped and imprisoned. And the same if you see people around you who are in those situations, stay close to them, don't let them become isolated, don't abandon them, because it's frustrating when you're seeing them being treated so badly yet they stay. You can be the very key that eventually leads to them unlocking the door to freedom. And finally, I think let's just all remember Caroline's family. This is very, very recent. They will still be dealing with the emotional collateral and fallout that will last a lifetime, but right now will be so present. They deserved so much more. And the only ray of light in this is that that little girl, Lydia, is going to be cherished and loved, and hopefully one day will turn out just as beautiful, wonderful, compassionate, endearing, and loyal as her mother was. And that's something that I think will inevitably occur because of the incredible grandparents, stroke parents that she is now in the arms of. Loads of love, guys. See you again next time.